I should have known something felt off the moment I saw the gas station on the edge of that forgotten highway. It was one of those old ones, the kind you can't believe is still open, with a flickering neon sign and pumps that probably hadn't been upgraded since the early 80s. But my tank was running low, and I hadn't seen another station in at least 50 miles. I told myself it was fine, just a quick stop, fill up, and get back on the road. It was late afternoon, and the light was starting to fade. The air felt heavy, almost too quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the steady ping of the gas pump and the faint crackle of an old radio inside the station. There was no attendant in sight, just a grimy counter and a shelf stocked with expired snacks. I waited by the pump for a minute, glancing around, but no one came out. Finally, I decided to go inside. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the little bell above jingled weakly. The smell hit me right away. Stale air mixed with old coffee and something faintly metallic. There was a counter with a cash register and a dusty rack of maps by the window. Behind the counter, a door stood slightly ajar, leading to what I guessed was a back room or storage area. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. No answer. I walked up to the counter and tapped on it, leaning slightly to peek into the back room. Still nothing. For a second, I thought maybe the place was just abandoned and the pumps were left running. But there was a steaming cup of coffee on the counter and a jacket draped over the chair behind it. Someone had been here. I turned back toward the door, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt outside. I felt an itch at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know you're being watched. Then I heard it, a faint thud from the back room. Not loud, but distinct enough to make me freeze. It wasn't the kind of noise a building makes when it settles, and it definitely wasn't a raccoon knocking over a trash can. I should have walked out right then, gotten in my car and driven away, even if it meant running out of gas 20 miles down the road. But curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was stubbornness. Either way, I stepped around the counter and moved toward the door. "Hey," I called again, my voice quieter this time. "You okay back there?" No response. The door creaked as I pushed it open wider. The back room was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, swaying gently as if it had just been bumped. The room was cluttered with boxes, cleaning supplies, and an old metal desk covered in papers. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a messy storage room. But then I noticed the door at the far end of the room, slightly open. A cold draft seeped through the crack, carrying with it a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and rotting leaves. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But something about that open door felt like an invitation I couldn't ignore. I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. I stood at the top, peering down. The smell was stronger here, almost suffocating. I could barely make out the bottom of the stairs, where the faint outline of a dirt floor came into view. I took a step down, the old wood creaking under my weight. Then another. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. By the time I reached the bottom, I could barely see anything. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and damp. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old tools, jars of God knows what, and strange bundles wrapped in cloth. Then I saw it, a large tarp in the center of the room, covering something bulky. It was stained and lumpy, with dark patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an old deer carcass or some roadkill the owner had dragged down here for some insane reason. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I moved closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My fingers trembled as I reached for the edge of the tarp. Then the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly. The only light was the weak beam from my phone, illuminating the bottom half of the stairs. I sprinted toward them, my feet slipping on the damp dirt. Halfway up, I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. I stopped, pressing myself against the wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The footsteps moved across the floor above, pausing directly above the staircase. Then they started down, one step at a time, each creak louder than the last. I bolted. I didn't care how loud I was anymore. I flew up the stairs, slamming into the door with my shoulder. It burst open, and I stumbled into the back room, knocking over a stack of boxes. The footsteps were right behind me. I didn't look back. I tore through the gas station, my shoes skidding on the tile floor. I hit the door at full speed, bursting out into the cool evening air. My car was still parked by the pump, the driver's door wide open. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but I didn't have time to think about it. I dove into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear, peeling out of the lot. My tires squealed on the asphalt as I sped down the highway, the gas station shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop, not for miles, not until the neon lights of a diner came into view, glowing like a beacon in the dark. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still trembling as I killed the engine. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out at the empty highway. My mind was a blur, replaying everything that had just happened. I thought about going inside the diner, telling anyone what I'd seen. But what would I even say? Instead, I sat there until my breathing slowed and the trembling in my hands stopped. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened back there, it was done. But deep down, I knew I'd never really forget that gas station, or the footsteps, or the cold, dark room beneath it. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never drive that stretch of highway again. I can't tell you exactly why I took that road. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just a bad decision fueled by tired eyes and the kind of stubbornness that creeps in after hours of driving alone. Either way, it happened. And now, looking back, I wish I'd stayed on the highway. Started around 3 in the afternoon. I was driving through a stretch of the Midwest, flat, open country for miles. The kind of place where you could stand on the side of the road and watch your dog run away for 3 days. There wasn't much out there, just an endless ribbon of road cutting through fields and the occasional abandoned barn, leaning like it had given up a long time ago. My plan was simple: make it to the next town before dark, grab a motel room, and crash for the night. But somewhere along the way, I decided to take a shortcut. I'd seen a narrow road branching off the main highway. No signs, no markers, just a cracked asphalt path leading into the horizon. I figured it might shave off some time, and honestly, I was sick of staring at the same stretch of highway. The first few miles were fine. The road was rough but manageable. It twisted and turned in ways the highway never did, cutting through patches of trees and low hills. I even started to enjoy it. The countryside was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the grass. Felt like stepping back in time. But then, things changed. The road got narrower. The pavement crumbled into gravel, and the trees closed in on both sides, their branches arching over the road like they were trying to block out the sun. My car rattled and bounced over the uneven surface. I told myself it was fine. Just a few miles and I'd hit another main road. No big deal, except the miles kept stretching on. 5 miles turned into 10, 10 into 20. My cell service flickered, then disappeared completely. I hadn't seen another car since I'd left the highway. The road felt more like a forgotten trail than something people actually used. That's when I started feeling uneasy. There was no specific reason for it, just a slow, creeping sense that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, the way it does before a storm, even though the sky was still clear. I kept driving, convincing myself I'd eventually hit another road or pass through a small town. But the trees got thicker, the road got worse, gravel turned to dirt, and deep ruts appeared, forcing me to slow down to a crawl. My car's tires slid and crunched as I tried to navigate around holes that looked deep enough to swallow the front end. I'd never felt so isolated. Even the birds had gone quiet. After what felt like hours, I finally saw something up ahead. A house. Well, more like the remains of one. It sat back from the road, half hidden behind tangled bushes and trees. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were dark and empty. A rusted-out truck sat in what had once been a driveway, its tires flat and its body covered in a thick layer of grime. I slowed down as I passed, peering out the window. The house looked abandoned, but something about it made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched. My eyes darted from window to window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. But there was nothing, just shadows. I pressed the gas, eager to put some distance between me and that house. My heart was beating a little faster now. I told myself it was just my imagination. Old houses are creepy. It's normal to feel uneasy, but the road didn't let up. It twisted and turned like a snake, each bend revealing more trees and more emptiness. The afternoon light started to fade, turning the sky a dull shade of orange. I checked the clock on my dashboard. 5:45 p.m. sunset wasn't far off. I had to find my way back to civilization. Fast. Then my car hit a pothole so deep it felt like the bottom fell out of the world. The front end slammed down hard, and the engine sputtered before cutting off entirely. I sat there for a second, stunned. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned the key, praying it would start again. Nothing, just a sad click, click, click. I got out and popped the hood. Not that I knew what I was looking for. The engine hissed, a thin wisp of steam curling up into the air. Great, just great. I stood there for a moment, hands on my hips, staring down at the engine like it might magically fix itself. The woods around me were silent, too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start hearing things that aren't really there. I tried my phone again. No signal. I held it up, turning in a slow circle, hoping for a single bar. Still nothing. My options were limited. I could sit in the car and hope someone happened to drive by, or I could start walking. Given how deserted the road was, walking seemed like the better bet. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed a bottle of water and a flashlight inside, and set off down the road. The sun was sinking fast, shadows stretching long across the ground. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and leaves. I walked quickly, my footsteps crunching on the dirt road. Every now and then, I'd glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one, just the trees and the fading light. After about 20 minutes, I saw another house up ahead. This one looked slightly less abandoned than the last. The roof was intact, and there was a light on in one of the windows. My chest flooded with relief. Finally, maybe whoever lived there could help. I walked up the driveway, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The house was small, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The light in the window flickered like it was coming from a TV. I knocked on the door, my knuckles rapping against the wood. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Hello? Anyone home? Still nothing. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. The living room was empty, the furniture covered in sheets. Dust hung in the air, catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. "Hello," I called out again. My voice sounded small in the empty house. I took a few steps inside, my shoes creaking on the old floorboards. The TV in the corner was on, but the screen was nothing but static. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. Then I heard it, a soft creak from somewhere deeper in the house. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, straining to listen. Another creak, this one closer. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving across the hallway. Not fast, not sudden. Just a slow, deliberate movement. That was all it took. I bolted out of the house, my feet pounding against the porch steps. I didn't stop running until I was back on the road, my lungs burning and my heart ready to burst out of my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what that shadow was. I just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, praying I'd find help before night fell completely. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck bouncing down the road toward me. I waved my arms, practically throwing myself into the road to make sure they saw me. The truck slowed, and the driver rolled down his window. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind, and I nodded, breathless. "Car broke down. Been walking for miles." He nodded and gestured to the passenger seat. "Hop in. I'll take you to town." I didn't hesitate. Climbing into the truck, I sank into the seat, my body sagging with relief. The driver didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer many answers. I just stared out the window, watching the dark trees whip past. We made it to town about 30 minutes later. The driver dropped me off at a gas station, where I called for a tow truck. As I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about that house, that shadow. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there in those woods, something I didn't want to understand, and I was never taking a shortcut again. I don't know when exactly I realized I was in trouble. The first couple of hours didn't feel like anything out of the ordinary. Just a long drive on some back roads to clear my head. It wasn't supposed to turn into something worth remembering, much less writing about. I just wanted space, time to think, time to get away from everything for a while. That's why I took the back roads. I've always preferred the quiet stretches of highway, the long ribbons of asphalt cutting through nothing but fields and forest. No traffic, no noise, no distractions. Just you and the road, stretching out forever. The day started normal enough. I packed a couple of water bottles, some snacks, my phone, and an old printed map, just in case. It wasn't like I planned to be gone for long, maybe a few hours at most. I wasn't expecting bad weather, and the gas tank was 3/4 full. I figured I'd drive west for a while, then loop back toward town when I felt ready. First, it was everything I wanted. No one around for miles, just me and the hum of the engine. The windows were down, and the air smelled like pine and cut grass. I passed a few farmhouses, the kind that looked abandoned but might still have someone living there. A rusty truck in the yard, a half-collapsed barn leaning to one side. Nothing unusual for these parts. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw. Eventually, there were none. Just trees and the occasional dirt road branching off into the woods. I lost track of how many miles I'd covered. Felt good, not knowing where I was or where I was going. The sun was high, and everything felt wide open and endless. Then the first weird thing happened. I hit a crossroads. Nothing strange about that, except I didn't remember seeing it on the map. I pulled over and checked. According to the map, the road I was on didn't have any intersections for another 20 miles. But here I was, staring at two dirt roads cutting across the pavement. It wasn't a big deal. Maps aren't always accurate, and these were probably old service roads or logging trails. I figured they hadn't been updated. Still, something about it made me pause. I took a picture of the sign, a rusted-out green thing with no words on it, and kept driving. About an hour later, I realized I hadn't seen another car in a long time. Not that it was unusual out here, but it felt strange. I was used to at least passing the occasional pickup or tractor, but there was nothing, just me and the road, and that strange feeling in the back of my mind that something was off. I tried to shake it. No reason to get paranoid. I had my phone if I needed help. Except when I checked, there was no signal. 0 bars. Again, not unusual for these back roads. I'd driven through plenty of dead zones before. It was just a little unsettling. That's all. I told myself I'd turn around at the next decent place to pull over and head back the way I came. Except there wasn't any place to turn around. The road was narrow with thick trees on either side. I would have had to reverse a long way to find a clearing wide enough, and I wasn't keen on backing up blindly in the middle of nowhere. So I kept going, hoping the road would eventually loop around or widen out. Didn't. Instead, the pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt. I slowed down, trying to decide if I should keep going or stop and figure things out. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. I was tired, hungry, and starting to get that gnawing feeling in my gut. The one that tells you something is wrong, even if you can't put your finger on it. Then I saw the house. It was barely visible through the trees, just a flash of white paint and dark windows. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in a long time. The roof sagged in places, and the front porch was leaning so far to one side I thought it might collapse. But it was a house, and I figured maybe I could ask for directions. I pulled off the road onto what was left of the driveway, more like a pair of ruts in the grass, and parked in front of the house. The engine ticked as it cooled, and for a moment, everything was perfectly still. I didn't get out right away. Something about the place made me uneasy. Maybe it was the silence or the way the windows seemed to watch me. I sat there for a minute trying to decide what to do. Then I noticed the door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Like someone had been standing there watching the road and left it ajar when they went back inside. I don't know why, but that made my skin crawl. I almost backed out right then. I should have, but I told myself I was being stupid. It's just an old house, probably abandoned. Nothing to be scared of. So I got out. The ground was soft underfoot, damp from recent rain. The air smelled like wet leaves and mildew. I walked up to the porch, my boots thudding on the warped boards. The door creaked when I pushed it open. "Hello," I called. My voice sounded strange in the empty house, like it didn't belong there. I waited, but no one answered. The inside was worse than the outside. Dark, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered around. An old couch with the stuffing coming out. A table missing 2 legs. The floor was littered with debris. Papers, empty cans, a tattered blanket. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of rot and something else I couldn't place. "Anyone here?" I called again. Still nothing. I should have left. I know that now, but I was curious. I've always had this problem. I need to know things even when I shouldn't. I figured I'd take a quick look around, maybe find something that could tell me who used to live here. I stepped into what must have been the living room. The floor creaked under my weight. There were pictures on the wall, but the glass was so dirty I could barely make them out. I wiped one clean with my sleeve. It was a black and white photo of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 kids. They weren't smiling. The longer I stood there, the worse I felt, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. I moved through the house quickly, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The kitchen was a mess of rusted appliances and broken cabinets. The bathroom was worse. Mold creeping up the walls, a cracked mirror hanging over the sink. Then I heard it, a thud, coming from upstairs. I froze. My heart started pounding. Could have been anything. A raccoon, a branch falling on the roof. But in that moment, it felt like the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I backed out of the house, my breath coming fast. I told myself not to run. Running makes you look like prey. I forced myself to walk, even though every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. I reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. The headlights lit up the house, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. Just a shadow there and gone. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove faster than I should have, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. The road twisted and turned, and for a while, I wasn't sure I was even going the right way. My hands were slick on the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I saw pavement again. I've never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. I followed it until I hit a main road, then pulled over to catch my breath. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. I still don't know what I heard in that house or what I saw in the window. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination, running wild in an empty house. Or maybe not. Either way, I won't be taking the back roads again anytime soon. It started with a simple drive. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Just me, my truck, and a 2-lane highway cutting straight through nowhere. I had taken this route before, twice actually, but always during the daytime. The road was quiet, isolated, and stretched forever. That's what I liked about it. No traffic, no distractions, just open land as far as the eye could see. I left around dusk, thinking I'd make it home well before midnight. That was the plan, at least. The first hour was uneventful. I cruised along, watching the horizon swallow the last bit of daylight. The sun dipped lower, bleeding red and orange across the sky before fading into deep blue. Soon enough, it was dark. Really dark. The kind of dark you only find far away from cities, where there's no glow from streetlights or neon signs. Just pitch black all around you, broken only by the narrow beam of your headlights. I wasn't nervous at first. I'd always liked driving at night. Felt peaceful, almost calming. The hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. It all worked together to create a kind of white noise that I found soothing. The road was straight and empty, lined on both sides by endless fields of dry grass and scattered clusters of trees. No towns, no houses, no signs of life. Just the road and the night. But then my truck started acting up. It began with a small hiccup, nothing serious, just a stutter in the engine. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a fluke. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, the engine cut out for a split second before roaring back to life. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I glanced at the dashboard. No warning lights. The temperature gauge was fine. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, plenty to get me where I was going. Still, the engine kept stuttering, each hiccup lasting a little longer than the last. By the time I hit the second hour of driving, the stuttering had turned into full-blown sputtering. The truck struggled to maintain speed, jerking forward in short bursts before slowing down again. I let off the gas and coasted for a bit, hoping it would smooth out. Didn't. Finally, the engine gave one last cough and died completely. I coasted to the side of the road and rolled to a stop. The silence was deafening. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark road ahead of me. My headlights stretched out into the distance, illuminating nothing but empty pavement and more fields. I tried turning the key again. The engine cranked but wouldn't start. "Great," I said to no one. I popped the hood and stepped out of the truck. The air was cool and dry, with just a hint of wind rustling through the grass. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as I walked around to the front of the truck. I lifted the hood and leaned in, shining my phone's flashlight onto the engine. I'm no mechanic, but I knew enough to check the basics. The battery connections were tight.
No obvious leaks.
The belts looked fine. I checked the oil. It was a little low, but not dangerously so. Everything looked normal. I tried the key again. Nothing. That's when it hit me how alone I really was. No cars had passed in the last 30 minutes. No lights in the distance. No cell service. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. No bars. Not even a single dot of signal. Just a little no service message in the corner. I cursed under my breath. I knew there was a small town about 40 miles up the road. If I could just get the truck started again, I could make it there and find help. But the truck wasn't going anywhere. I considered my options. I could wait and hope someone drove by, but who knew how long that would take? Hours? Maybe all night? Or I could start walking and try to find help on foot. I looked down the road, weighing my choices. The idea of walking through the middle of nowhere in the dead of night wasn't exactly appealing, but sitting in a dead truck all night didn't seem much better. At least if I walked, I'd be doing something. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stuffed it into my pocket, along with my phone and a bottle of water. I locked the truck and started walking. It didn't take long for the silence to get to me. At first, I welcomed it. The cool night air felt good on my face, and the steady rhythm of my boots on the pavement was oddly comforting. But after a while, the silence became oppressive. It pressed in on me, filling the empty space with an almost tangible weight. Every little sound seemed amplified: the rustle of grass, the crunch of gravel, the distant call of some unseen animal. I tried to stay focused, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. But the farther I walked, the more aware I became of just how exposed I was. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. The road stretched on forever, a narrow ribbon of black cutting through the darkness. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I could barely see beyond the beam of my flashlight. Everything beyond that was just nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something up ahead, a shape in the distance, just barely visible in the glow of my flashlight. It looked like a building, a small shack, or maybe an old gas station. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and anticipation. Finally, a break. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station or a shack. It was an old farmhouse, long abandoned and half collapsed. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged in the middle. The front door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored it and stayed on the road. But something about the house drew me in. Maybe it was the hope of finding a working phone. Maybe it was just curiosity. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. I pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with dust. The floor was littered with debris, old newspapers, broken furniture, bits of plaster that had fallen from the ceiling. I swept my flashlight across the room, taking it all in. It was obvious no one had lived here for a long time. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the floorboards were warped and rotten in places. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. There was something unsettling about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt wrong, like the house was watching me. I found a phone in the kitchen, an old rotary model, covered in dust and grime. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. Dead. Not even a dial tone. I set the phone down and turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. They were fresh, too fresh. I froze, my heart racing. I listened, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. Nothing. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. I reached the front door and stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't stop walking until I was back on the road, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I walked after that. Time seemed to blur, each step blending into the next. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look back. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance, a pair of bright white dots growing larger and larger. I stepped into the middle of the road and waved my arms, my flashlight swinging back and forth. The car slowed and pulled to a stop beside me. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a friendly face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. I nodded, too tired to speak. "Hop in," he said. "Let's get you out of here." I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door behind me. As we drove off, I glanced back at the road. The old farmhouse was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I never did figure out whose footprints those were, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be gone. It was supposed to be a simple drive, a 3-hour trip to a cabin my cousin owned, nestled in the middle of nowhere. A quiet retreat, something I thought I needed after everything going on lately. Work stress, personal stuff. My head felt like it had been buzzing for weeks, and this was supposed to help clear it up. The plan was to leave around noon, get there before sunset, settle in, and just have some peace and quiet for the weekend. It sounded nice when I imagined it. No people, no noise, just me and the woods. But things don't always go the way you expect. The trouble started about halfway through the drive. I was cruising along a 2-lane road that cut through miles of dense forest. No other cars in sight. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I noticed my gas gauge dipping lower than I remembered. It wasn't too bad, but enough to make me pay attention. Then my phone lost service. No bars, not even a sliver of a signal. I tried refreshing it a few times, but nothing came back. I wasn't too worried at first. It's normal in places like this, I figured. I'd just check again when I got closer to the cabin. The trees seemed to close in the further I went. The road got narrower, too. Barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, though there still weren't any in sight. My headlights weren't on yet, but the sun was fading fast. I kept driving, glancing at the gas gauge more often now. The needle was dangerously close to empty. I cursed under my breath, tapping the dash like it would somehow change anything. The GPS was useless without service, so I had no idea how far I was from the cabin or the nearest gas station. Then, like some kind of twisted miracle, I spotted a small sign on the side of the road, faded and crooked, almost hidden by the brush. It read "Gas, 10 miles," with an arrow pointing down a dirt road to the right. I hesitated for a second, slowing down. The dirt road looked rough, barely wide enough for my car, but I figured 10 miles wasn't too bad. I could make it there and back before it got too dark. Better than running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I turned onto the dirt road. The tires crunched over gravel and dirt as I bumped along, the suspension groaning under me. The trees pressed even closer here, their branches clawing at the sides of the car like they were trying to keep me out. The road twisted and turned, dipping into small valleys and climbing steep hills. After a few miles, I started feeling uneasy. There were no signs of any buildings or people, just more trees and more road. My gas gauge was almost on empty now, the little warning light glaring at me from the dash. I told myself to keep going. 10 miles. That's what the sign said. I come this far, and turning back now didn't make sense. But the further I went, the worse it got. The road narrowed even more, the gravel giving way to patches of mud and rocks. My tires spun a few times, struggling for traction. The sun was nearly gone, just a faint orange glow on the horizon, and the shadows had swallowed the forest whole. Then, out of nowhere, my car sputtered. I felt the engine lose power, the acceleration dropping away like I'd hit a wall. I pressed the gas pedal again, but nothing happened. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. I sat there for a second, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. "Shit," I muttered. I tried turning the key, but the engine just clicked. Not even a hint of life left in it. I checked my phone again, hoping for some miracle signal, but the screen stayed blank. No bars, no nothing. I was completely alone. I climbed out of the car, the cool evening air wrapping around me. It smelled like damp earth and pine, thick and heavy. The forest was deathly quiet, not even a hint of wind to stir the branches. Just silence. I popped the hood, though I had no idea what I was looking for. The engine looked fine, no smoke or leaking fluids. Not that it mattered, I wouldn't have known how to fix it anyway. For a moment, I just stood there, staring down the road. The dirt stretched on into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. There was no sign of the gas station.
No lights.
No buildings. I had two choices: stay with the car and hope someone came along, or start walking. I knew staying with the car was probably the smarter choice. It was safer, but something about sitting there in the growing darkness, completely exposed, felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in me screamed to keep moving. So I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and started walking. First, it wasn't too bad. The road was rough, but the flashlight cut through the dark well enough. I kept expecting to see headlights in the distance, hear the sound of an engine, but the road stayed empty. The trees seemed taller now, their trunks thick and gnarled. The air felt heavier, too, like it was pressing down on me. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes, the beam of my flashlight sweeping through the woods. I tried not to think about how far I'd gone, or how far I had left to go. After what felt like forever, I spotted something up ahead, a small clearing barely visible through the trees. For a second, I thought it might be the gas station. Relief flooded through me as I hurried toward it, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station at all. It was an old house. It looked abandoned, 2 stories tall, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. The paint had peeled away, leaving bare wood exposed to the elements. The front porch leaned dangerously to one side, the railing missing several posts. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight at the house. There was no car in the driveway, no lights in the windows, no sign of anyone living there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stood there for a long time, debating whether to go closer. Part of me wanted to check it out just to see if there was a phone or something I could use. But another part of me, the smarter part, knew it was a bad idea. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Then I heard it, a sound from inside the house. It was faint, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. But it was there. A soft creak, like a floorboard shifting underfoot. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I waited, straining to hear anything else. But the house went silent again, like it had been holding its breath. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and started walking back down the road, my flashlight swinging wildly in front of me. My footsteps sounded too loud, each one echoing in the stillness. I forced myself to keep moving, resisting the urge to break into a run. The road stretched on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. I didn't stop, not even when my legs ached, not even when the flashlight flickered again. I just kept going, my eyes locked on the road ahead. Eventually, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but it grew brighter with each step. It was the gas station, a small, run-down building with a single flickering light above the door. A rusty old gas pump stood out front, covered in peeling paint and cobwebs. I stumbled toward it, my heart racing. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was dark and empty. Dust covered the shelves, and the air smelled like stale oil and mildew. There was a counter near the back with an old rotary phone sitting on top. I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. It rang twice before someone picked up. "Hello," a voice said, crackling through the line. I nearly collapsed with relief. "I'm stranded," I said, my voice shaking. "My car broke down. I need help." The voice on the other end paused for a moment. "Stay where you are," they said. "I'll send someone out." I hung up and sank to the floor, my back against the counter. For the first time in hours, I felt safe. And then, through the dirty window, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. Help had finally arrived. The road stretched ahead, gray and cracked, disappearing into the horizon like it had no intention of ever ending. I didn't even know why I took this route in the first place. It wasn't the smartest choice, but it seemed like a shortcut at the time. You'd think after living in this area for years, I'd know better than to trust the GPS when it suggested a back road shortcut. It was one of those late fall afternoons when the sky stays gray all day. It looked like it could rain at any minute, but never actually did. The trees lining the road were mostly bare, their branches thin and skeletal, like they'd been picked clean by the wind. The whole area felt hollow. Empty fields stretched on both sides, broken by the occasional patch of trees or a sagging, weather-beaten barn that looked like it hadn't housed anything but ghosts of hay bales in decades. The gas gauge was dropping fast. I'd noticed it when it hit a quarter tank, and I had this brief moment of panic. There was no sign of a gas station anywhere, just mile after mile of nothingness. I kept telling myself there had to be something soon. Some small town, a rest stop, anything. I didn't want to pull over and check my phone because there was no service out here. My phone might as well have been a brick at that point. The first real jolt of fear hit when I realized just how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no wind, no passing cars. Not even the distant hum of machinery from a farm or something. It was just my engine and my tires crunching over the cracked asphalt. After about 30 more minutes of driving, the needle was dangerously close to E. I was sweating a little, even though the temperature outside was probably in the low 50s. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. Worst case scenario, I'd run out of gas and have to walk back the way I came until I found some sign of life. I wasn't dressed for a long walk, but I had a jacket in the back seat, so it could have been worse. That's when the engine started to sputter. I let out this half laugh, half groan, like I couldn't believe it was actually happening. I pumped the gas pedal a few times, hoping it would catch, but no luck. The car rolled to a stop right there in the middle of the road. No shoulder, no pull-off area, just dead in the center of this empty stretch of nowhere. I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard like it could somehow fix itself if I gave it long enough. The trees swayed slightly in the distance, but it was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. "All right," I muttered to myself, "time to walk." I grabbed my jacket from the back seat and slipped my phone into my pocket out of habit, even though it was useless. Locking the car felt silly, but I did it anyway. Old habits die hard. Then I started walking. The road felt even more desolate on foot. The cracks seemed deeper, the trees taller and darker. Every step sounded too loud, like I was disturbing something that had been asleep for a long time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. Of course, there was nothing. There never was. I walked for what felt like hours. The sky grew darker, but it wasn't sunset yet. It was just that kind of deep gray that makes you feel like you're running out of time. My feet were starting to hurt, and my stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that was just a granola bar and some coffee. Finally, up ahead, I saw something. It looked like a house or maybe a small building, set back from the road. It was one of those moments where you're so relieved to see something familiar that you almost cry. I picked up my pace, my legs aching with each step. As I got closer, I realized it was definitely a house. Not a nice one, though. It looked abandoned. Windows boarded up, paint peeling, the porch sagging like it had given up trying to stay upright. But there was something off about it. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but the closer I got, the more I felt it. I paused at the edge of the overgrown yard. The house was silent, but it felt like it was watching me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an empty house in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it felt creepy. I considered my options. I could keep walking and hope I found a real gas station or a house that looked less like a horror movie set. Or I could check it out, see if there was anyone inside who could help. The second option seemed like a long shot, but I was tired, hungry, and honestly a little desperate. The front door was slightly ajar. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The air smelled stale, like wood rot and dust. I knocked once, then twice. Nothing. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. I pushed the door open a little more and stepped inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt and dead leaves, and the wallpaper was peeling in long strips. Furniture was scattered around, old chairs, a broken table, but it all looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked through the front room, my footsteps echoing. I found a small kitchen at the back. The sink was full of rust-colored water, and there was an old fridge humming softly in the corner. That was the first thing that struck me as weird. If the place was abandoned, why was the fridge still on? I opened it out of curiosity, and the smell hit me instantly. Rotten food, spoiled milk, something sour and putrid. I gagged and slammed it shut. The power might have been on, but no one had cleaned that thing out in a long time. That's when I heard it. A soft creak from upstairs. My heart stopped for a second, and I froze. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but it didn't feel right. It sounded too deliberate, too much like a footstep. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to listen. Another creak, this time closer, like it was coming down the stairs. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and bolted out the front door, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road. There was nothing there. No one standing in the doorway, no movement in the windows. Just the house, silent and still, like it had been the whole time. I kept walking, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it really was just the house settling. Or maybe there was someone in there, a squatter or something. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. Pickup truck rattling down the road toward me. I waved my arms like a maniac, practically jumping into the road. The truck slowed, and the driver, a man in his 60s with a worn-out baseball cap, rolled down his window. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing me like I just crawled out of a ditch. "Ran out of gas," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Been walking for hours." He nodded. "Hop in. Closest gas station's about 15 miles back." I climbed into the passenger seat, sinking into the worn-out cushion with a sigh of relief. As we drove past the house, I glanced back one last time. It was still there, still quiet. I never did find out who or what was in that house. Maybe it was nothing, just an old building creaking under its own weight. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is I never took that shortcut again, and I never will. I've always been the kind of person who likes quiet. I enjoy solitude, calm moments, and stretches of time alone, away from the noise of everything. When I hit the road that Friday evening, I wasn't thinking about anything more than getting to my destination. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, just me, my truck, and a cabin a few hours away. Nothing fancy, just some time to clear my head and disconnect. I left after work, the sun already starting to dip below the horizon as I packed a few essentials. A duffel bag, some snacks, bottled water, and my phone with a full battery. The cabin was in a quiet, remote part of the state. No cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I'd been there before once or twice. This time, though, I was going alone. The drive started out peaceful. The first couple of hours passed quickly, the hum of the tires on the road blending with the sound of the radio. Towns thinned out, traffic disappeared, and soon it was just me and miles of empty highway cutting through the countryside. The air was cool, the sky turning darker by the minute. By the time I hit the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun had fully set. My headlights cut a narrow path through the dark, illuminating the trees lining both sides of the road. The forest felt thick and endless, pressing in on me from every angle. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, the sound echoing in the quiet. The cabin was still a good 20 minutes ahead, deep in the woods. I knew the way well enough not to worry, but something about how dark it was made me uneasy. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No houses, no lights, just trees and more trees. I kept driving, trying to shake off the unease. The air felt colder, and the road seemed narrower than I remembered. I glanced at my phone, no signal, just as expected. I still had about half a tank of gas, which was more than enough to get me there and back the next day. Then, out of nowhere, my right front tire hit something. It wasn't a hard jolt, more like a sudden dip, but enough to throw me off for a second. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. My headlights barely lit up the trees ahead, casting long, flickering shadows. I left the engine running and stepped out to check. The air was colder than it should have been for early fall, and the smell of damp leaves filled my nose. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the front of the truck. The tire looked fine at first glance, but when I crouched down and ran my hand over it, I felt the problem. A long, jagged piece of metal sticking out of the side. Great! I muttered to myself. A flat tire in the middle of nowhere. I changed tires plenty of times before, so it wasn't a big deal, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I popped the tailgate and pulled out the spare and jack. The forest was dead silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of my own movements. I worked quickly, wanting to get back on the road as soon as possible. I jacked up the truck and loosened the lug nuts, keeping an eye on the shadows beyond the headlights. The trees seemed closer than before, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. As I worked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I glanced over my shoulder a couple of times, but there was nothing there, just darkness and trees. I focused on the tire, trying to ignore the knot of tension growing in my chest. The new tire was on in about 15 minutes. I tightened the last lug nut, lowered the truck, and tossed the tools back into the bed. When I turned to get back into the cab, I froze. The driver's side door was open. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. I was sure I had closed it when I got out. I remembered the click of the latch, the weight of the door as I pushed it shut. but now it was wide open, the interior light casting a dull glow onto the gravel. I swallowed hard and walked toward the truck, my eyes darting around the trees. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I reached the door and peeked inside. Nothing looked out of place. My bag was still on the passenger seat, my phone sitting on top of it. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly, and it swung open on its own. Yeah, that had to be it. I climbed back in, shut the door, this time making sure it was closed, and started the engine. The road ahead seemed darker than before. The trees pressed in closer, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. I drove slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. Every bump in the road made my stomach twist. I just wanted to get to the cabin, lock the door, and forget about this whole thing. About 10 minutes later, I saw something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it was a backpack lying in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating the worn fabric. It looked old and dirty, like it had been out here for a while. I stopped a few feet away and stared at it. There was no sign of anyone around, just the backpack sitting there, like it had been dropped or left behind. Part of me wanted to drive around it and keep going, but something about it nagged at me. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? I left the engine running and stepped out, leaving the driver's side door open this time. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. I walked toward the backpack, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. When I reached it, I nudged it with my boot. It felt heavy, like it was full of something. I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, I found clothes, a water bottle, and a flashlight. There was also a folded-up map and a small notebook. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had short, handwritten notes. They were hard to read in the dim light, but one of them caught my eye. "Don't stop. Keep moving." They watched from the trees. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. The darkness felt deeper, thicker. I shoved the notebook back into the backpack and stood up, my pulse racing. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling in the trees behind me. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps on dry leaves. I spun around, my eyes searching the shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No response, just the rustling growing closer. I backed toward the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. The rustling stopped, but the silence felt worse. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to run. I climbed back into the truck, slammed the door, and locked it. The engine was still running, and I floored the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the road. The backpack lay on the passenger seat, its contents forgotten for the moment. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. When I pulled into the driveway, I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was dark, the windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I grabbed the backpack and my duffel bag and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I turned on every light in the cabin, checking every room, every closet. Everything was empty, just as it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I set the backpack on the kitchen table and pulled out the notebook again. This time, I read through every page. Most of the notes were short and cryptic. "Stay quiet, don't trust the lights, they move at night. I didn't sleep that night." Every creak, every groan of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. I kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife by my side, my eyes never leaving the windows. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I grabbed my stuff, threw it back into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that cabin. It started as just another road trip, a way to clear my head and get some time away from the noise. I had always liked the open road, especially the parts where the highway stretched for miles with nothing but plains on either side. There was something peaceful about it. No traffic, no people. Just you, your car, and the hum of tires on asphalt. That's all I needed. I was heading north through a part of the country I hadn't been before, taking the back roads because I hated interstates. The kind of roads where you might not see another car for hours, where gas stations are rare, and the only signs of life are the occasional farmhouse or a rusting truck parked on the side of a gravel road. The weather was decent enough, cold but clear, and I figured I'd make it to the next town before dark. My tank was just under half full. I wasn't worried. I had driven through worse places with less gas and still made it. The road rolled out in front of me, empty and endless, like a strip of gray cutting through the dried-out fields. About an hour in, I noticed how quiet everything felt. Not just the road, but the land itself.
No birds.
No wind, just an eerie stillness that settled into my chest. I brushed it off as nothing more than the isolation. I hadn't seen another car in at least 30 minutes. Then the trouble started. I glanced down at my dashboard and noticed the temperature gauge climbing. Fast. Too fast. At first, I thought it had to be a glitch. My car wasn't that old, and I'd kept it in good shape. But when the engine started to sputter, my stomach sank. Shit, I muttered. I pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching under my tires. Steam started hissing from under the hood. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second, staring out at the empty landscape. Nothing but dead grass and power lines stretching into the horizon. I popped the hood and got out. The cold hit me hard, biting at my face and hands. The engine was hot to the touch, and steam was rising from the radiator. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to realize this wasn't something I could fix on my own. I stood there for a minute, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. No cars in sight, no houses, no signs of life at all. Just me and the road. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I tried walking around, holding the phone up like an idiot, hoping for even one bar. Nothing. I leaned against the car, staring down the road in both directions. Felt like standing on the edge of the world, where everything just stopped. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I had two choices: stay with the car and hope someone came along, or start walking. I checked the map on my phone. According to the GPS, which barely loaded, I was at least 15 miles from the nearest town. No way I'd make it before dark. Still, sitting around didn't feel like an option. I grabbed my backpack from the trunk, stuffed a bottle of water and a flashlight inside, and started walking. The road stretched on forever, straight and flat, with nothing but fields on either side. The sky was turning that pale shade of gray-blue that comes just before dusk, and the temperature was dropping fast. My breath puffed out in little clouds, and my footsteps echoed in the silence. I kept glancing back at my car, watching it grow smaller and smaller until it was just a dot on the horizon. I walked for what felt like hours. The cold seeped into my bones, and my legs started to ache. I kept telling myself that someone would come by. Any minute now, a car would appear in the distance, and I'd wave it down, and everything would be fine. But no one came. Eventually, the sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness settled over the land. The stars came out, bright and cold, but they didn't offer much light. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. It made me feel a little better, but not much. The road looked different at night, more isolated, more hostile. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift, and the silence was almost oppressive. I kept walking, trying not to think about how alone I was. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind, maybe, but then I heard it again, a faint rustling, like something moving through the grass. I stopped and listened, my heart pounding. Nothing. I shook my head, laughing nervously. Just the wind. I kept walking, but the sound came again, closer this time. I swung my flashlight toward the field, the beam cutting through the darkness. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, but there was nothing else. Just an empty field stretching out into the night. I told myself I was being stupid. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up the pace, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The rustling seemed to follow me, staying just out of sight. Every time I turned around, the sound stopped. By the time I saw the faint outline of a building in the distance, I was practically running. It was an old gas station, the kind you'd see in movies about road trips gone wrong. The windows were dark, and the sign was faded and peeling, but it was something. A place to get out of the cold. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor was covered in dust. Shelves stood half empty, stocked with ancient cans of soup and boxes of cereal that had probably expired years ago. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No answer. I found a dusty old chair and sat down, trying to catch my breath. My legs were killing me, and my fingers were numb from the cold. I needed to rest for a minute, just long enough to warm up. Then I'd figure out what to do next. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of footsteps. My eyes snapped open, and my heart jumped into my throat. Someone was outside. I sat perfectly still, listening. The footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were walking around the building, circling it. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind the counter, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I couldn't see who it was, but I could hear them moving around. Their footsteps were slow, deliberate, like they were looking for something, or someone. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and the door creaked shut. I waited a few more minutes before daring to move. I peeked over the counter, my eyes scanning the darkened store. Empty. I grabbed my backpack and crept toward the door, my heart in my throat. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. The night was still and silent. No sign of whoever had been there. I didn't stick around to find out if they were coming back. I ran down the road, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. I didn't stop until I was sure I was far enough away. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming toward me, its engine rumbling in the quiet night. I waved my arms, nearly collapsing in relief when it pulled over. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged guy with a tired face. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Car broke down. Been walking for hours." He motioned for me to get in. "Come on, I'll take you to town." As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back down the road. The gas station was barely visible in the distance, just a dark shape against the night sky. I never found out who or what had been there with me, and I didn't want to. It started as just another trip, a weekend getaway to clear my head. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, some snacks, and my old tent that hadn't seen much use since college. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote campsite in the national forest, spend a couple of days hiking and enjoying the silence, and then head back to civilization. Nothing fancy, no deep wilderness survival challenge. Just some peace and quiet. I should have known better. I left on a Friday morning. The drive out of the city was smooth, the highway thinning out as suburbs melted into farmland and then into stretches of thick forest. I didn't mind being alone. I welcomed it. Work had been chaos lately, and the constant hum of the city had me on edge. I needed this, needed to hear nothing but the wind in the trees and my own footsteps crunching on dirt. The trailhead was exactly where the old guidebook said it would be, marked by a faded wooden sign barely visible through the overgrown brush. I parked my car at the edge of the gravel lot and locked it, stuffing the key into the deep pocket of my backpack. The air smelled clean, like pine and damp earth. Felt good to breathe it in. The first few hours of hiking were easy, the trail well-worn and obvious. Birds chirped overhead, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden patches. I followed the map carefully, making sure I stayed on the marked trail. The guidebook promised a perfect campsite near a small creek about 6 miles in. By late afternoon, I found it. A clearing in the woods with soft moss underfoot and just enough space for my tent. The creek bubbled nearby, its water clear and cold. Perfect. I set up camp, pitched my tent, and started a small fire. Dinner was a simple affair, just a can of chili heated over the flames. I ate slowly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. When night fell, it fell fast. The woods turned from welcoming to something darker, something ancient and untamed. My fire seemed smaller in the vast blackness. I told myself it was just my imagination. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to a sound, something rustling in the underbrush. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to hear. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even a possum. Nothing to worry about. But then it came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps through the dry leaves. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept the flashlight in my hand as I lay back down. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Morning brought a sense of calm. Whatever had been out there was long gone. I convinced myself it really had been a deer or some other harmless animal. Still, I packed up camp quickly and decided to explore a little farther before heading back toward the car. The map showed a longer loop that would eventually lead back to the trailhead. I figured it would add another day to the trip, but that was fine. I had enough supplies. The trail grew narrower as I went, the trees closing in on either side. Felt more remote, less traveled. I liked it at first. It was what I had come for, real solitude. But around midday, things started to feel off. The trail seemed less like a trail and more like a faint path worn into the underbrush. I checked the map again and again, but nothing looked right. I hadn't seen a marker in miles. The trees all looked the same, and the terrain had grown steeper, more rugged. I should have turned back. I know that now, but I pressed on, convinced I'd find the trail again just over the next ridge. By late afternoon, panic started creeping in. I was lost, truly hopelessly lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods had a way of swallowing up any sign of where I'd been. The sun hung low in the sky, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I needed to find shelter. I stumbled onto a small rocky overhang, a shallow cave carved into the hillside. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire at the entrance, hoping the light and smoke would keep anything curious at bay. I barely ate. My stomach was knotted with fear. The second night was worse. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness absolute beyond the flickering light of my fire. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my pulse racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sounds this time. It was something else. Something I couldn't put my finger on. A sense of being watched. At some point, exhaustion won out. I drifted into a fitful sleep, my back pressed against the cold stone of the cave wall. I woke with a start sometime in the early morning hours, my fire reduced to glowing embers. The woods were dead silent. Not even the wind stirred. Then I saw it. Barely a glimpse, a figure moving between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight. Not an animal, person. They were gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness, but my blood turned to ice. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the hatchet I had packed for chopping firewood. My eyes never left the trees. At first light, I broke camp and started moving. I didn't care about the map anymore. I just needed to go somewhere. I headed downhill, reasoning that I'd eventually hit a road or a stream that would lead me out. Hours passed. My legs burned, my feet blistered. Every snapping branch made me flinch, my eyes darting to the shadows. I felt like a hunted animal. By midday, I found the creek again. Relief flooded through me. If I followed it, it would eventually lead to something, a road, a town, anything. I picked up my pace, the sound of rushing water guiding me. I don't know how long I walked. Time lost all meaning out there. Then I saw it, a flash of metal through the trees. My car. I ran the last 100 yards, my lungs burning, and practically threw myself at the driver's side door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the key. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. I backed out of the lot and tore down the gravel road, my tires kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I never went back to that forest. Never even looked at the guidebook again. I still think about it sometimes, though. About the figure in the woods. About the footsteps outside my tent. About how close I came to never leaving that place. And I wonder, were they just passing through? Or were they waiting for me to come back? It all started with a wrong turn. Not an unexpected one, given how spotty the signal was out here in the middle of nowhere. I was heading home after a weekend trip up north, my GPS flickering on and off, throwing me reroutes every few minutes. The sky had started to shift into that dim, grayish light just before dusk, and with every passing second, I felt a little more lost. The road had narrowed, too, no signs, no markers, nothing but cracked asphalt and dense trees on either side. For miles, I hadn't seen a single car. No houses, just the occasional rusted-out mailbox or overgrown dirt road veering off into the woods. It felt like one of those roads no one drives down unless they have to. Still, I kept going, convinced it would loop back to the main highway eventually. It had to, right? Roads always connect somewhere. But it didn't. The asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel eventually gave way to dirt. By now, it was too late to turn back. My gas gauge blinked at me. I slowed the car to a crawl, weighing my options. Keep pushing forward and hope for a gas station or a house with someone who could help. Or stop here and risk spending the night in the car, hoping morning would bring clarity. Neither seemed like a good idea. I drove for another 10 minutes. The road was rougher now, more like an old logging trail than something meant for regular cars. My tires crunched over rocks and roots, the trees pressing in so close they almost brushed the sides of the car. And then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Not a big one, but enough to pull over. I killed the engine, and the silence hit me like a wall. No hum of tires, no faint buzz from the dashboard. Just the wind and the creak of branches swaying overhead. I sat there for a few minutes, staring out at the darkening woods. The answer seemed obvious. Find help. Staying in the car felt wrong, like I'd be sealing myself in a tomb if I did. But the thought of walking through those woods alone wasn't much better. I popped the trunk and grabbed my flashlight and a bottle of water. My phone was useless now, no service, battery down to 12%. Still, I slipped it into my pocket out of habit. The trail ahead looked like it might lead somewhere, or maybe it didn't. There was no way to know until I followed it. I walked for what felt like forever, my footsteps muffled by the soft dirt and fallen leaves. The flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, illuminating just enough to keep me moving. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. And then I saw it, an old house half hidden by the trees. It was small, barely more than a cabin, with a sagging roof and windows boarded up from the inside. The wood was gray with age, the front porch tilting to one side like it had given up years ago. But there was a truck parked out front. It looked just as worn out as the house, rust crawling up the sides, tires half flat. But it meant someone had been here recently. Maybe they still were. I approached slowly, calling out as I neared the porch. Nothing. The door was cracked open, just enough to see into the dim interior. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Knock first. Always knock first I did, the sound dull and hollow. Still nothing. I pushed the door open a little more, just enough to step inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, settling on every surface. The place was empty, or it looked that way. A single room mostly, a rickety table and a couple of chairs, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a mattress on the floor. No pictures on the walls, no personal touches, just the bare minimum. I called out again, my voice echoing back at me, and then I heard it, a faint noise from the back of the cabin. A thud, followed by a dragging sound. My heart jumped into my throat. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But something made me stop. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. I stepped toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The back of the cabin was darker, the windows boarded up so tightly no light could get through. I moved slowly, scanning the floor for anything that could make a sound like that. And then I saw it, a trapdoor partially hidden beneath an old rug. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. The thud came again, louder this time. It was coming from beneath the floor. I stood there, torn between opening the door and running back to my car. My fingers brushed against the edge of the trapdoor, the wood rough and splintered beneath my hand. I don't know why I did it, but I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the ground. I called out one last time, my voice barely more than a whisper, and then I started down. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step feeling like it might give way. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the smell getting stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, the dirt floor stretched out in front of me. The walls were lined with shelves, jars filled with strange things I didn't recognize, tools that looked like they belonged in a butcher shop, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. But what caught my eye was the table in the center of the room. It was covered in maps and notebooks, all spread out like someone had been in the middle of something when they were interrupted. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the pages. They were filled with notes, coordinates, dates, strange symbols I didn't recognize. And then I saw the pictures, Polaroids, dozens of them, each one pinned to the wall above the table. Faces stared back at me, some smiling, some serious, some terrified. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't just random pictures. They were people who had gone missing, people who had probably ended up right where I was standing. And then I heard the footsteps behind me,